So, all right. Okay. Thank you, Ilsa. So I'm working right now on this project that's funded by the BC Ministry of Environment or Ministry of Agriculture, because there's kind of some ongoing questions about pollinator communities in the north. So just to kind of review for people, pollination is an essential ecosystem service. And, for most flowering plants, estimates vary anywhere between 75 to 88% of species out there. They need animals to help them reproduce. So typically in Canada, usually it's insects. We don't have like a ton of, bats or kind of larger animals that do pollination. Insect pollinators or arthropod pollinators more broadly are hugely important to this basic ecosystem service. What's more, in terms of human society and even human economies, about 30% of global crop production requires animal pollination in order to happen. And the fact is that there's no way to get around this with some crops. So all the good stuff, we're thinking vanilla, we're thinking avocado toast, we're thinking coffee and chocolate. All of these things require animal pollination. In those few cases where a pollinator has been lost or a crop is being grown somewhere where its native pollinators aren't, often humans end up pollinating. So vanilla is a good example of this, where you have this huge human input into simply pollinating a plant, because there are no replacements sometimes for pollinators. So, at the bottom there is a shot of somebody hand pollinating squash, which is not what you want to have to do. Ideally, you're going to grow plants in systems where pollinators are readily available, to ensure that you're going to get a crop out, and to ensure that you don't end up consuming valuable resources trying to find another way to pollinate plants. You may have heard a little bit about robot pollinators. There are a couple of companies exploring that, but on a broad scale, kind of in large scale operations that aren't greenhouses, that are out, in the open air, it's just not an option. We've got to hang on to our pollinators. And, in doing this project, one of the things I've gotten a little bit of pushback about is, a number of farmers have told me, well, I don't grow something that relies on animal pollination. It's wind pollinated. And the fact is that there's good evidence to show that even for plants, crops that are wind pollinated, that are self-fertilizing, there's a number of features of crops that really benefit from having animal pollinators around. So these are just a couple of studies. The one on the left was conducted on cotton, and they showed that kind of the quality of the product that you get out is much better when insect pollinators are present and available to pollinate the plants. And this is largely because they facilitate outcrossing. The same thing goes for canola, which is hugely important to the Canadian kind of farming economy. In cases where pollinators are allowed access to plants, even though canola is not dependent on insect pollinators, when they're around, seed biomass goes up. So the profitability of that crop increases. So generally, anybody that's growing anything should probably be invested in making sure that there are pollinators around. There are probably lots of benefits we haven't even discovered yet, because we haven't really been looking for them. Because in most cases, pollinators are just always there, right? The other kind of misconception I encounter sometimes when I'm talking to people about pollination, especially pollination up here in the north, is that they often think that you need domesticated honeybees, so Apis mellifera, in order to have consistent pollination. And the fact is, there are a number of groups of insects that provide excellent pollination service. These are just a couple of figures from a couple of recent reviews, one by Doyle and colleagues, and they showed that Diptera, so flies, are the second most important order of pollinating insects. They visit something like 72% of crops compared to about 93% for Hymenoptera. And then Lepidoptera, so butterflies and moths, come in about third. But the figure on the left, that diagram, shows that there's significant overlap between kind of the Apidae, which are kind of the traditional pollinating bees that we think of, Halictidae, which are sweat bees, so they're small, kind of solitary, often ground nesting bees, and syrphids, which are hoverflies, so dipterans. There's a lot of overlap in terms of the number of plant species that they're able to pollinate successfully. On the right is a figure from a meta-analysis by Rader and colleagues, and they actually look at the overall fruit set across a whole bunch of studies. And they found that when other bees are present, so we're talking non-domesticated bees, fruit set goes up quite a bit. So it's really important to recognize that we don't need to rely on domesticated, managed pollinators to have great pollination success. There are lots of pollinators out there. We've just got to make sure that they have the resources they need. So one of the reasons why pollination often goes up when you have multiple species of pollinators around is that different species of pollinators often have complementary habits. So Cusser and al. Showed in a massive study of working cotton farms in the American South that different groups of pollinators can access different places on the plants. And so they increase the pollination success because cotton has a really narrow window of time when it can be pollinated. This is a huge deal. So when butterflies and flies are present in these fields to pollinate cotton, they increase the functional visitation space so they can get into places that bees can't by something like 50%. So non-bee species and kind of non-apidae bees may be really important to ensuring that plants get pollinated successfully. The other thing that diverse pollinator communities have is a little bit of resilience. And so this is just a figure from a Bartolomeu study showing bees from kind of different genera and showing their average emergence state relative to apple blooming over a long period of time. What they showed was that different groups of bees, I'm really sorry, the dog is barking. Different groups of bees are available at different times to pollinate apples, so that when flowering dates shift a little bit in a community with high biodiversity in pollinators, there's always going to be something around that can probably pollinate those flowers. So generally, it seems like the consensus is that having higher pollinator biodiversity kind of buffers pollination services so that if something happens, there are enough species with enough diverse kind of life cycles and preferences that pollination will usually be provided, even if, something is, flowers earlier or later than usual, things like that. However, currently there's also starting to be some evidence that agricultural development may cause declines in pollinator biodiversity. So these are, you know, two kind of fairly recent studies that show in a variety of crops, in a variety of systems, that when you increase the proportion of land being used for agriculture, you experience a decline generally in species richness. So why inventory pollinators in the middle of nowhere? BC's central interior is definitely not undergoing major agricultural development right now. This area has largely, you know, the major kind of activity out here for a long time has been logging, not agriculture. However, right now, if you look at the predictions for future climate in this area, the central interior, and that's the area kind of in that box on the map, about 500 clicks north of Vancouver, it might be, relative to lots of other places in the world, a winner when it comes to climate change, because it's looking like, though temperatures are going to rise in this region, precipitation is likely to remain relatively similar over kind of the next 50 to 100 years. And as a result of climate change, we're expecting to see increased growing degree day accumulation. The growing season is expected to start earlier and last longer. And this kind of has opened up some ideas around, we need to be planning for the agriculture of tomorrow here. And so if there are opportunities or farmers want to do things like grow new crops, try different varietals, they need to know what's out here that's available to pollinate, because this is a pretty remote area, and you know, carting domestic pollinators all over the place and moving hives in every year is not really an option up here in the same ways it is kind of in places like the Lower Mainland or down in California, where, you know, they farm almonds and they bring in, you know, millions of honeybees every year. It's just not an option up here. So having a sense of what the pollinator community out here is like, and perhaps how it varies with some of the landscape kind of features that are here, is kind of a good way to get rolling on kind of opening doors for the agricultural sector. So generally up here, there have been some, you know, collecting trips, and there are records on places like iNaturalist for the kind of pollinators that people see up here, but nobody really knows which native pollinators are actually found in agricultural areas as opposed to less disturbed areas. So that's kind of the first goal of this project, is to figure out what's hanging out where in these areas that are already a little bit disturbed by ongoing agriculture. And then the second question is to evaluate whether there are some land use or management practices that may be affecting pollinator biodiversity. In particular, the presence or absence and size of forest patches is something that we're quite curious about. And then the other question kind of has to do with seasonal change, and how, when farmers hay, so they mow down a lot of the resources in fields, is that affecting local pollinator biodiversity at all, especially those pollinators that are available in agricultural areas to pollinate crops. So last summer, I went out and I recruited 18 sites in the Bulkley and Chaco and Fraser Fort George regional districts. It's really hard to get them all on one map because it's a massive area. So these sites were scattered along kind of Highway 16 between Smithers, which is about a 4-hour drive west of Prince George, and McBride, which is about a 2-hour drive east of Prince George. And it's largely an east-west corridor. And, you know, these sites represent a variety of production systems. So we have, you know, about 5 of them were pasture or ranches. There was a dairy farm. There, about a third of the sites were involved in forage crop production, so largely alfalfa. And there were 6 sites that were engaged in kind of mixed vegetable or fruit production, so either market garden or kind of larger organic operations that supply like restaurants. All of these sites were people who opted in, so they'd gotten kind of a recruitment letter and they had opted in. And it turned out that none of them are using any kind of like spray applications of pesticides. So that piece of the puzzle is kind of controlled for. But there certainly was a wide diversity in terms of the kind of things people are growing and how they manage their land. They're, ranchers think about land and think about, ground cover and vegetation very differently than somebody who is growing alfalfa as a cash crop. So that was something that I'm still trying to manage a little bit in the analyses, but certainly I think it resulted in us getting a wide swath of pollinators coming into the wide variety of plants. So there were a couple of different methods I used to survey pollinators. One was vane traps. So on every site on a field margin, I would put in a pole in the ground and hang up one of these vane traps. They're colored blue as kind of an attractive, a way to attract pollinators in particular. And blue has been shown in literature to be particularly attractive for Hymenoptera, for bees, in many cases. And so these were put up kind of mid-May and were checked about every 3 weeks. But the traps that I'm mostly going to focus on today, the samples I'm going to focus on today, are from pan traps. So in order to kind of look at how local forest habitat is affecting pollinator communities, I used pan traps in 3 different colors and laid them out in transects, one near the edge of a field and then one in the interior of the field. And these varying colors were kind of put on these pan traps with kind of this special UV paint that I got from a theater supply company because many pollinators are attracted to kind of UV signals on flowers. So highly recommended if you're doing pollinator work. The UV paint works great. And we were really successful in terms of the number of kind of solitary bees and hoverflies that came into these traps. These were generally put out for a 24-hour period about once every 3 weeks. So I would show up, I would empty the vane trap, I'd put pan traps down, and then the next day I would come back and collect the contents of the pan traps. And at most sites, somewhere between kind of 4 and 6 rounds of sampling to produce separate edge and interior samples so that they could be compared later for kind of diversity and abundance. When samples came into the lab, they were sorted to morphotype, and we used DNA barcoding for much of the identification work because so many of these groups, particularly the little tiny bees, are incredibly hard to identify. And in a lot of cases, we don't even have really great keys for Canadian species. Not to mention, we weren't really sure what was out there. So we were very lucky to be able to send morphotypes to the University of Guelph, to the Canadian Centre for Biodiversity Genomics, so that they could sequence the mitochondrial CO1 gene, a portion of it, to produce a barcode that we could then search against the database to determine species identities. And yeah, this was relatively successful. We had the funding for 665 specimens. We sent those, and we ended up with, I think 586 of those morphotypes actually rendered a barcode. So I had to go back and do some old-fashioned dichotomous key work on the remaining morphotypes. But by the end of it, we had 346 distinct species that were identified via barcoding. 32 more were identified via dichotomous keys and other things in the lab. And then I sat down with all the species names and I did a literature search to figure out which of the specimens, the morphotypes that we'd identified, were likely to be, important pollinators as opposed to just kind of occasional pollinators, because the pan traps tended to get a fair number of like musket flies and things that are not necessarily great intentional pollinators. They're not necessarily super adapted to pollinate. And so I sat down and I went through all of those. And by the end of it, it looked like we had about 242 species that were what I like to call likely pollinators. I then sat down and did some tabulating. And it turns out that even though we found a ton of pollinating dipterans, the most frequently observed pollinators in these samples in agricultural areas are all hymenopterans. They're all bees. 4 of 5 of them are Bombus species, so bumblebees, and they're widely distributed, these particular species. The one thing that all the Bombus here have in common is that they're all from the subgenus Pyrobombus, which is the bumblebee group that has body sizes that are a little bit smaller, which I thought was interesting. I think this may have something to do with temperature management, because smaller bodies are more able to dissipate heat. The other groups of bumblebees that we observed were things like Bombus apodsatus, so the white-shouldered bumblebee, the frigid bumblebee. And if you get into the literature and you take a look, kind of one of the key differences between these groups that we saw that were super common and widely distributed across the landscape, and the groups that were only kind of locally abundant, so you would find them at 1 or 2 sites within the region, is their body size is quite different. So the big body bees tended to not show up widely distributed across the landscape on multiple sites, like the species here, like Flavifrons and Vancouverensis. So those 2 photos at the bottom left there, those are both Vancouverensis nearcticus. I just wanted to show those to kind of drive home the thing around. Some of these species, even though they're quite large, can be pretty hard to identify because there are multiple color morphs within a given species. But yeah, so 4 bumblebee species were found widely distributed at anywhere between kind of 40 and 60% of sites. And then there was 1 halictid, so a sweat bee, that was found across a wide swath of land. Other than that, most of the other bumblebee species found, and we had a total of 17 species of bumblebee, most of the other bumblebees that were identified seem to occur on kind of 2 to 3 sites and within a fairly limited range of time. These bumblebees all seem to be able to be present from quite early in the season until quite late in the season. So I sampled from mid-May until right at the end of August, all the way through the heat dome. So that's something that I need to investigate further, but I was quite surprised given that in the pan traps, I quantified something like 15,000 dipterans, but only kind of 8,500 hymenopterans. I was quite surprised that Hymenoptera were more broadly distributed than dipterans. The other kind of key group of pollinators that we identified via barcoding and a little bit of kind of taxonomic key work was syrphids, so hoverflies. overall, we found 63 species, which is just massive. Quite a lot of them look very similar to everybody else. But what was interesting about them was there were a ton of species, but they would only occur on 2 or 3 sites. And they were quite a lot more limited in their range, with the exception of a couple of species that were widely distributed. It was very different from the Hymenoptera. Interestingly, when you sit down and you kind of start plotting things, there was kind of a weak negative relationship between syrphid and bumblebee abundance, particularly the non-pyrobombus, so the large-bodied bumblebees. And I'm not sure what this is yet. Generally, in traps in the interior of fields, more bumblebees would be caught there. They were generally more abundant out in the middle of the field, which I was quite surprised at. And syrphids were kind of more evenly distributed. So they generally didn't show a strong preference for edge or interior. In terms of the more broad question of whether proximity to a forest affects diversity in general, there were typically more items in pan traps found near forest edges, and there were more unique morphotypes. However, when you sat down and you identified all those morphotypes, it turns out that there are only marginally more species of likely pollinators in pan traps located closer to forests. And overall, the abundance of those species in those pan traps near forests is slightly lower. So interestingly, when you look at different groups of Hymenoptera, they're, oh my God, the dog is freaking out. There is generally, I haven't been able to pick up on any patterns yet in sweat bees, so halictids, the little guys, but andrenid bees, which are another kind of ground nesting group, and they're really hard to tell apart visually. They tend to be more abundant near forests, while bumblebee species don't. And one of the things that this is kind of bringing up is whether forests are functioning to provide some nesting habitat or other resources, especially for things like andrenids, halictids that are generally solitary nesters. And so this is something that we kind of have to develop a little bit more as we go along. And that is going to be a focus for the project as we head into the second year. This is some initial work done by me. This is a non-metric dimensional scaling of the kind of major syrphid and Hymenoptera groups, and separated by crop types. So kind of the fruit and vegetable growers showed a community that was kind of more characterized by bumblebees, colitids, which they're called cellophane bees. They're not super common, but they did turn up more often in fruit and vegetable growing sites. And orthonevra, which are these like small metallic syrphids, small metallic hoverflies. In contrast, in areas where forage crops and kind of pasture was the kind of the function of the field, larger, more kind of larger bodied syrphids tend to be more common. So the Holophilus species, those are kind of big, burly syrphids. They are great beneficials because they also have larvae that often will eat aphids. And then the other thing that we found that was more common in these areas used for forage cash crops were some of the andrena, so those kind of solitary ground nesting bees, and osmia, which are megacylids. So they are with the kind of the mason bees and the leaf cutters. They're quite kind of remarkably shiny blue, and they are kind of hugely useful for anybody who's growing alfalfa. They're really great pollinators of alfalfa plants, which is something that a lot of bees will not pollinate because the flowers are quite difficult to get into. So it makes sense. Osmia are good. They're the one species in particular, the buffle-headed mason bee that we picked up. They're quite large and burly, and they don't have a hard time getting into alfalfa. Yeah, so there are some differences in terms of the pollinator communities starting to emerge. I have some more work to do in terms of characterizing these communities, but the fact is that the list is so long, particularly of hoverflies. I was really shocked that 242 species came out of this. Making sense of it has proven a little bit of a challenge. So in terms of the one thing everyone wants to know, seems to be, well, what can I do to help, right? Farmers and others are always so keen to do things to kind of promote pollinator biodiversity. For some of them, it's part of their environmental farm plan, or if they are looking to progress towards getting certified organic, things like that. They always want to know what to do, and it's quite hard because I'm still at a stage where I'm not really sure what to tell them. I'm still looking at it, but hopefully we're going to move into looking at some potential targets for pollinator conservation in this area. One might be to look at retaining floral resources by avoiding mowing, or limiting mowing or haying only to areas where it's really essential. The other place to kind of think about making some changes is to look at managing field margins and non-productive areas a little bit differently. So potentially seeding in wildflowers that are kind of known resources for local bees, and practicing kind of no-till methods to preserve areas with nice soil for bee nesting. So there's some good evidence to show that bees don't like to nest in agricultural areas that regularly get tilled, because often the soil, well, it wrecks their nests, but it also kind of disturbs the whole habitat. And so in the UK, you may have seen some of the signage or the PR around No Mow May, but that's something that we're wondering about looking at this coming field season. So the kind of pieces that are kind of outstanding to kind of better understand and characterize the system include looking at floral resources. There's lots to suggest that plant diversity fosters pollinator diversity. And if sufficient resources are available during difficult times, like during the heat dome, these may help them buffer. So if they have enough food, they may be able to buffer against abiotic stressors. And the literature suggests that early spring and late summer are particularly important times when resources are available. So this year we're going to do some floral surveys when we go out and do pollinator collections, to see if we can start linking the emergence and presence of particular species to the flowering and presence of particular flowers. The second thing, that seems to be coming up in the literature a little bit more now, but which I'm not necessarily able to do, is to monitor interactions with domesticated pollinators. So Apis mellifera is an incredible super generalist incredible super generalist pollinator. And it's, in some cases, there's some work that's been done, particularly in Scandinavia, that shows that they may be able to outcompete native pollinators in some places. And I know people love their beehives, but at the end of the day, it's worth thinking about whether it's worth bringing in something that's going to outcompete native pollinators that are doing a great job already. The other thing is that for many of the native species here, they are pretty robust to temperature variation and they know how to manage it. Apis mellifera is often quite sensitive to temperature. And so they may not be the greatest pollinator for plants up here, especially as climate change comes. And so, yeah, getting people to take a second look at their practices around domesticated pollinators is something that we're looking at. The other piece is to look at landscape heterogeneity and connectivity, because they may provide other resources, in particular nesting habitat, which I've mentioned already. This is part of my hunt for farms with appropriate forest patches. I'm really looking out for that because I would like to be able to sample some more in areas with forest patches that vary in size. Oh, there we go. Okay. So in terms of what people are, if you're curious about looking for more resources or hunting down some more information about pollinators, the UK's dopi.org is an excellent resource. If you're ever looking to find out, I had to look up all these species and figure out, well, do they interact with plants? Do we know if they're pollinators? This database in the UK is phenomenal. It's got individual records for observations and everything is scored. So it has pollinator quality. If you ever have the name of a bug and you want to know if it's pollinator, I would head to DOPI. It's an excellent resource. There are also some wonderful keys out there. Discover Life is great for bees, but a lot of people don't know that we have some homegrown, amazing Canadian researchers who work on hoverflies on syrphids that have put together an interactive key through the Biological Survey of Canada. If you're ever trying to key anything out or you just like to learn a little bit about syrphids, I would highly recommend you head over there and take a look at it. It's incredible work. It's homegrown. It's wonderfully put together. And then the other thing is for folks who are looking to do some pollinator plantings, Pollinator Partnership Canada has planting guides for different regions of Canada, not just BC. And they are downloadable and they also have a searchable tool. So you can go on there and say what kind of growing conditions you'd like to grow something in that's going to be good for pollinators. And it will recommend kind of regionally appropriate plants for any kind of pollinator conservation or enhancement work that you're going to do. So yeah, that's it. I know I'm still hip deep. I got the barcoding data last week, so I am still absolutely hip deep in this stuff. So this came a little faster than I was expecting. But yeah, anybody who has any information on pollinators or who wants to let me know their brilliant ideas for how to parse this massive data set, I would be thrilled. But yeah, that's the story.